In this video, we're going to talk about nutrition and energy flow. More specifically, we're going to look at food webs and food chains, which hopefully, for most of you, is going to be a review from middle school. Before we can talk about what a food chain is, or even what a food web is, we have to review a couple concepts. So, for the sake of this unit, realize that the word obtain means to get, and that everything can pretty much trace its energy back from the sun. So the sun is going to be the ultimate source of energy. Energy, for definition, is going to be the ability to cause change. So for anything in your body to happen, you need energy. We talked about energy during our cell unit as ATP. When we were talking about the kingdoms, we talked about what it meant to be autotrophic. But just as review, autotrophs are the producers. So producers are things that can turn light energy from the sun into food through photosynthesis. Pretty much anything in the plant kingdom and some types of protists. Just as a quick review, try to fill in the blanks of these three statements. Think back to our study of plants and think back to our study of cell organelles and see if you can't fill in the blanks. The first thing you should have seen is that photosynthesis happens in the cell leaves in special organelles called chloroplasts. Photosynthesis is done by plants, and it allows them to make their own food, and photosynthesis is the process turning light energy into sugar. Next, we talked about what heterotrophic meant. So heterotrophs are consumers. A consumer can't make its own food, so it has to eat other organisms. So we're consumers, rabbits are consumers, all animals are consumers. So are fungi and our bacteria. Other vocab it's important to know, if you don't remember this from middle school, is what a herbivore is. So that would be someone who eats only plants. A carnivore is someone who eats only animals. Omnivores eat plants and animals. Scavengers eat leftovers or dead animals, and decomposers, which are our fungi and bacteria, break down dead or dying material. We'll talk more about decomposition later. So 4 important points to know are: why do organisms need food? Because that's where we get our energy from. Energy flows from the sun to producers or plants, and finally to consumers of all levels. Flow just means to move. Think like how water flows. And the last thing that we're going to talk about later is energy is transferred from one organism to the next, but a lot of energy is actually lost in that transfer. So when energy goes from a hamburger into a human, you don't actually get and keep all the energy from that food. But again, we'll talk about that later. So in middle school, you talked a little bit about food chains, most likely. So a food chain is a model that kind of shows how matter and energy move through an ecosystem. So for instance, you might have a food chain where berries are eaten by rabbits, rabbits get eaten by a fox, and fox get eaten by a hawk. 2 important things for a food chain is the arrow shows which way the energy is moving. So for instance, the berries are moving into the rabbit or being eaten by the rabbit. We don't say that the berries are eating the rabbits. So keep that in mind. Whichever way the arrow points is also the way the food is moving into another animal. The next thing you have to know or remember from middle school is what each trophic level is called. So there's the trophic level of producers, so plants and things that make their own food. Anything that eats a plant is called a primary consumer. Anything that eats a primary consumer is called a secondary consumer, and anything that eats a secondary consumer is a tertiary consumer. One important thing that people often get confused by is if you eat plants and you eat, let's say, chicken, which is a primary consumer, you are still classified as a secondary consumer. So you always are going to be classified or called your highest possible level of consumer. So looking at our example from before, berries are considered to be producers, rabbits would be a primary consumer. The fox would be a secondary consumer. And the hawk is considered tertiary consumer. So again, even if it's true that, let's say, the hawk eats a fox and maybe the hawk eats a rabbit, which we'll talk about later, it's still consuming a secondary consumer, and therefore it's still considered a tertiary consumer. Since you went over food chains in middle school, and that should be a review, we're also going to talk about food webs. Food webs are pretty much food chains combined or put together. The reason food webs are better is because they show all possible feeding relationships for each trophic level. So basically, they take into consideration the fact that you don't just eat one thing, but you eat a bunch of things. And that's true for all animals. So, in a picture, a possible food web look like this. If, let's say, we look at the coyote, what we see is that he eats the kangaroo rat, he eats the weasel, he eats the jackrabbit, and he eats the roadrunner. Unlike a food chain, it's not just that he eats one thing. Or if, let's say, we look at the rattlesnake, he eats the lizard, the toad, and again the kangaroo rat. So we're looking at multiple things, but the arrows and everything still means the same. Now that you've watched this whole video, you should be able to answer the following questions based off this food web. 1. Who is the producer? 2. Who is the primary consumer? 3. Who is a tertiary consumer? And 4. Who is a secondary consumer? Make sure you don't mix up those words. So 2, who is a primary consumer, 3, who is a tertiary consumer, and 4, who is a secondary consumer. If you're easily able to do that, then you understand this video. If not, make sure you go back and watch so that you know all that vocab.